additional credentials from negotiator 1, and so on until either the access control policy associated with a resource is satisfied and the negotiation succeeds, or else no further credentials can be exchanged, in which case the negotiation fails. The eager strategy was introduced by us in this paper here, which appeared at the DARPA Information Survivability Conference and Exposition in the year 2000. It's not a really prestigious venue, but I'm pleased to report that it's had 34 citations listed in CiteSeer at this point. So I think that a lot of people have been interested in the trust negotiation stuff. There are several results in the paper about the eager strategy. First of all, it's complete in the sense that it'll find a negotiation whenever a sequence of disclosures exists that is safe. It's efficient in the sense that the number of rounds is at most linear in the number of credentials. And it's safe in a way that I'd like to basically spend the rest of the talk discussing. So what's the intuition? We don't want to share credential content with people that aren't authorized for it. But it turns out that the original notion of correctness or safety for automated trust negotiation doesn't really achieve this goal of protecting sensitive credentials. Now, Ninghui and I, in the year 2000, proposed a method that I'll show you that sought to protect attributes better, but we still didn't have a formal definition of what safety ought to mean. And then this year in the Oakland conference, we presented a formal statement of what of what safety should require. And that's actually going to be the crux of this part of the talk. And then I'll also mention a recent journal submission in which we show that a practical negotiation strategy based on RT satisfies the requirement. And so we might conjecture that the requirement is achievable. But there have been a lot of negotiation strategies proposed that don't satisfy it. And here are some of those, including one that I introduced myself back in 2000. What all of these have in common is that they establish access control policies that are used to control the disclosure of credentials in the sense of handing over the credential. And the way that the reason that they ran into troubles where actually the eager strategy did not is that they seek to focus credential disclosures on credentials that are somehow relevant to the requested resource and satisfying its access control policy. And thus, policy content needs to flow in order to focus the content of the credential disclosures. And a couple of these pieces of work, the third and fourth, actually discuss the fact that the policies themselves may be sensitive, which I think is a very important and interesting point, but not one that I'll dwell on further here. They all used the original notion of safety for credential disclosures, which is unfortunately inadequate. It said that a credentials access control policy must be satisfied before the credential is disclosed. But it doesn't say exactly what disclosed means. And using any of the strategies on the previous slide, the negotiator's behavior actually reveals a great deal about his credentials, no matter who he's negotiating with, even if they're not authorized for the credential content. Let me show you what I mean. Here, Bob has a credential he received from the Internal Revenue Service that says he's got low income. Maybe he can use it online to get pro bono legal assistance or things of that nature. But he goes, and he considers it to be sensitive, so he establishes an access control policy for this credential that says he'll only share it with not-for-profits. He goes to a real estate agent swampland.com and requests some property listings, at which point Swampland initiates a trust negotiation with him saying, I'd like to see your low-income credential. Now, using any of those strategies, in effect what Bob does is to give a counter request saying, well, I'd like to see your not-for-profit credential. And the problem is, now Swampland knows that Bob has low income, because if Bob didn't, he'd behave like Alice, who also doesn't, and just basically fail or give no response to the request for the low income credential. So in the Policy 2000 paper, we sought to protect attributes by introducing what we call acknowledgement policies. So these are by contrast with access control policies, and they're associated with attributes rather than credentials. And that enables you to establish them whether or not you actually have the credential. So what an acknowledgement policy does is to authorize knowing whether or not the negotiator has the given attribute. I won't tell you whether I've got it unless you satisfy my ACT policy. During a negotiation, I can show you the ACT policy for my low-income credential without implying that I have it. That's because I could easily have established it without having it. And this work was published in the IEEE Workshop on Policy. So here, Alice may also consider her income to be sensitive information and establish an ACT policy for it that says she'll only share that with not-for-profits. And if she does so, then her behavior is exactly identical to that of Bob's. Now, detractors have argued that people that have nothing to hide won't bother to use acknowledgement policies, thereby casting suspicion on those that do use them. But there's a key observation here, which shows why, in fact, I think they're workable. Anyone wishing to protect any sensitive attribute whatsoever has to protect some attributes about which he has nothing to hide. Otherwise, the mere fact that he's protecting one attribute indicates he's got something to hide there, and you can tell maybe his attribute there isn't so favorable. And probably guess what it is, for that matter. So in this context, if suitable acknowledgement policies were available, widely available for all attributes, the simplest approach would simply be to enforce them all. Okay? So our solution is, let's make them widely available, and achieve that by making ACT policy design part of attribute vocabulary design. A reference to an attribute has to contain somehow a reference to the vocabulary that's used in the attribute to avoid name collisions. So if we include with the vocabulary an acknowledgement policy, then when you ask me for any attribute, even if I've never heard of it before, I can just go to that URL, retrieve the acknowledgement policy, and serve it to you. So in the Oakland paper, we formalized an intuitive safety requirement for protecting attributes. This is the paper, Safety and Automated Trust Negotiation. And I'd like to quickly run through the framework so that I can state the safety requirement for you. Basically, a negotiator is assumed to have a configuration G, which gives a principal K that he has control over, and a set of credentials that he owns, E. Plus, there's a table of policies and a mapping from attributes to their acknowledgement policies. What can adversaries do? Well, we model them as sets of principles and their